My name is Maya, and 2 years ago, I stood in the middle of a small rented garden venue, stringing up fairy lights with shaky hands, knowing my parents wouldn't help pay for a single flower on my wedding day. They had just spent $50,000 on my brother's 30th birthday party, a glittering affair in a downtown ballroom with chandeliers that sparkled like they were mocking me. Meanwhile, I drained my savings, took a small loan, and risked everything to have the day I dreamed of since I was a little girl. I didn't think I'd ever recover from the sting of their rejection, the way they dismissed my joy like it was a minor inconvenience. But 2 years later, I made $1 million from a business I built with my own hands, and I left them behind. Not out of spite, but because I finally understood my worth didn't need their approval. This isn't just a story about money, it's about the quiet ache of being overlooked, the strength it takes to build something from nothing, and the moment you realize you don't need to beg for a seat at a table, you set yourself. Before I start, let me ask, have you ever been overlooked by the people who should have loved you most? Where are you listening from today? I can still hear my mother's voice on the phone, sharp and casual, like she was asking me to pick up groceries. Maya, weddings are overrated, you'll manage, she said when I asked if they could help with the costs. I was 28, sitting on the edge of my bed in my tiny apartment, clutching the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. I'd spent weeks working up the courage to ask, knowing how they'd always favored my brother, Ethan. But I thought, maybe this time, for something as big as my wedding, they'd show up for me. I was wrong. Ethan's party is a milestone. My father added on the call, his tone final like I was a child asking for candy before dinner. He's turning 30, Maya. It's a big deal. You'll understand when you're older. I was getting married in 3 months, but somehow my joy didn't count. I hung up without saying much, staring at the vision board I'd pinned above my desk, a collage of soft white dresses, lavender bouquets, and a small outdoor venue I'd fallen in love with. I'd saved $8,000 over 2 years, working extra shifts at the coffee shop and freelancing as a graphic designer. It wasn't enough, but it was all I had. I whispered to myself, I'll make it work, even as my chest tightened with the weight of their words. The next week, I drove to my parents' house for dinner, hoping to change their minds. The air smelled of roast chicken and garlic as I stepped inside, but the warmth stopped at the door. Ethan was there, sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his new leather jacket slung over the armrest, a gift from our parents for his big year. My mother was in the kitchen, humming as she stirred a pot, and my father sat at the table, flipping through a catalog of party venues. We're thinking of booking the Grand Elise for Ethan's party, my mother said, not looking up. They have a live band option. Isn't that exciting? I nodded, forcing a smile, my hands twisting the hem of my sweater. The Grand Elise was a luxury venue I'd once dreamed of for my wedding, but I'd settled for a small garden space that cost $1,500 to rent. That sounds amazing, I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. I was wondering if you'd thought any more about helping with my wedding. It doesn't have to be a lot, maybe just the catering. My mother turned, her eyes narrowing slightly, like I'd asked for the moon. Maya, we've already told you. We can't stretch ourselves thin. Ethan's party is a priority right now. My father didn't even look up from the catalog. You're resourceful, Maya. You've always figured things out, he said, like it was a compliment. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat growing heavier. Ethan glanced at me from the couch, smirking. Yeah, sis, you're good at the DIY stuff. Your wedding will be cute, he said, the word cute dripping with condescension. I wanted to scream, to tell them how unfair it was, but I didn't. I just nodded again, my nails digging into my palms, and sat through dinner, the taste of chicken turning to ash in my mouth. A month later, I stood in the garden venue I'd rented, a small patch of green tucked behind a community center, with wildflowers growing along the edges. It wasn't the Grand Elise, but it was mine. I'd spent the night before folding paper napkins into swans, my fingers trembling from exhaustion. My fiancé, Lucas, helped me set up wooden chairs I'd borrowed from a friend, their paint chipped but sturdy enough. We couldn't afford a band, so I made a playlist on my phone, soft acoustic songs that reminded me of the nights we'd spent dreaming about our future. The air smelled of jasmine and damp grass, and as the sun dipped low, casting golden streaks across the ground, I felt a flicker of hope. But it didn't last. My phone buzzed with a notification from our family group chat, a photo of Ethan's party invitation, gold embossed and elegant, with the words, "Join us for an unforgettable night at the Grand Elise," in bold letters. My mother had added a message, "So proud of our boy, can't wait to celebrate." I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. They hadn't even asked about my wedding plans, hadn't offered to help with a single thing. I locked my phone and slipped it into my pocket, blinking back tears. Lucas came up behind me, his hand warm on my shoulder. "It looks beautiful, Maya," he said softly. I forced a smile, but inside, I felt like I was crumbling. I'd risked everything, my savings, my energy, my pride, to make this day happen, and the people who should have cared the most didn't even notice. As I strung up the last of the fairy lights, I whispered to myself, "This is for me, not for them." But the ache in my chest told me I still wished they'd cared. The night of my wedding was a blur of laughter and love, but the empty chairs where my parents should have been sat like silent accusations under the fairy lights. Lucas and I exchanged vows in that little garden, my voice steady despite the knot in my throat, his eyes shining with a promise that made everything else fade for a moment. I'd sewn my dress myself, a simple white gown with lace sleeves, using a pattern I found online and fabric I'd bought on sale. The bouquet was wildflowers I'd picked that morning, tied with a ribbon from an old gift box. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, built from the scraps of what I could afford after my parents turned their backs. The guests, mostly Lucas's friends and a few coworkers of mine, clapped as we kissed, and I felt a rush of pride. But as the music played from my phone speaker, I couldn't shake the image of Ethan's party, happening just 2 weeks later, with its chandeliers and catered steak dinners. I'd seen the photos my mother sent to the family chat, Ethan in a tailored suit, my parents beaming beside him, a $50,000 celebration for a milestone they called essential. My wedding, by contrast, felt like a whisper in a room full of shouts, and the weight of that difference pressed down on me all night. After the ceremony, I sat on a folding chair by the edge of the garden, my dress pooling around me, sipping water from a plastic cup. Lucas was dancing with his sister, their laughter carrying over the soft strums of my playlist. I should have been happy, and part of me was, but the other part couldn't let go of the sting. My phone buzzed again, another update from the family chat, this time a video of Ethan cutting a 3-tier cake, the frosting glittering under the ballroom lights. "Best night ever!" My father's voice boomed in the clip, and I could hear my mother's laugh in the background. I turned the screen off, my fingers trembling, and stared at the ground where ants marched in a neat line across the grass. I'd taken a loan to cover the $2,000 I still needed after my savings ran dry, money I'd have to pay back with interest while working double shifts. I'd risked my financial stability for this day, believing my parents might at least show up to support me, even if they wouldn't pay. But they didn't. They sent a text an hour before the ceremony. "Sorry, Maya. Something came up with Ethan's planning. Congrats." I didn't reply. I just wiped my eyes, fixed my veil, and walked down the aisle with Lucas's best man as my escort, pretending the empty seats didn't hurt. The next day, I woke up in our cramped apartment, the ring on my finger catching the morning light, a reminder of what I'd gained despite everything. But the reality hit hard when I checked my bank account. $200 left after the wedding, with loan payments looming. I'd started a side hustle a few months earlier, designing logos for small businesses, something I'd taught myself with free online tutorials. It wasn't much, but it had earned me $500 in 3 months, and I'd poured that back into the wedding too. Now, with the loan hanging over me, I knew I had to double down. Lucas, bless him, took on extra hours at his job, but we both knew it wouldn't be enough. I sat at my desk, the vision board still above me, now smudged with coffee stains, and opened my laptop. "I'll make this work," I told myself, scrolling through job boards and client emails. That's when I saw it, a request from a local bakery for a logo design, offering $300 if I could deliver in a week. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start. I took the job, sketching late into the night, my fingers cramped but my mind racing with ideas. Ethan's party might have been their priority, but I decided my future would be mine. 2 weeks after my wedding, Ethan's party happened, and the photos flooded my phone like a tidal wave I couldn't escape. My mother sent a group message with a carousel of images: Ethan dancing with a champagne flute, my father handing out cigars, the table laden with lobster and caviar. A night to remember, she wrote, adding a heart emoji. I scrolled through, my stomach twisting, the taste of my own wedding cake, store-bought and slightly stale, still lingering in my memory. Lucas noticed my silence and squeezed my hand. "They don't deserve your energy," he said, his voice gentle but firm. I nodded, but it didn't stop the ache. I'd heard the party cost $50,000, money they'd pulled from savings they claimed didn't exist when I asked for help. My brother, lounging in the photos with that smug grin, had never worked a day harder than I had in the past month. I closed the chat, deleted the notifications, and turned to my laptop instead. The bakery logo was done, and the client loved it, paying me on the spot. I felt a spark then, a tiny flame of something I couldn't name yet. Pride, maybe, or defiance. I used the money to make my first loan payment, and that night, I stayed up sketching more designs, determined to turn that spark into a fire. As the weeks turned into months, that fire grew. I took on more freelance jobs, building a portfolio of logos and branding for small businesses, coffee shops, pet stores, even a yoga studio. Lucas supported me, cooking dinner while I worked, his quiet encouragement a lifeline when I doubted myself. My parents called occasionally, asking about my little projects, their tone patronizing like I was playing at something they didn't take seriously. "That's cute, Maya," my mother said once, "but don't quit your day job." I didn't argue. I just smiled and changed the subject, my mind already on the next client email. Ethan, meanwhile, bragged about his new car, a sleek sedan my parents had co-signed for him, while I drove a beat-up hatchback with a dented bumper. The contrast stung, but it also fueled me. I started investing the extra money I earned, putting it into a business course online and a website to showcase my work. It was risky. Every dollar I saved from the coffee shop went into it, but I felt alive, like I was building something they couldn't touch. Little did they know, that risk would change everything, and the day I'd make them eat their words was closer than I thought. The months after my wedding stretched into a year, and that tiny spark of defiance I'd felt with the bakery logo turned into a steady flame. I was working late nights, my laptop glowing on the kitchen table, surrounded by sketches and coffee cups, while Lucas slept on the couch beside me, his snores a comforting rhythm. My freelance business was picking up. Small jobs turned into bigger contracts, and I'd landed a deal with a local gym chain to redesign their branding for $2,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it covered the loan payments and left a little extra, which I poured into my website and a marketing course. The risk I'd taken, quitting my coffee shop job to go full-time freelance, felt terrifying at first, but every completed project built my confidence. My parents still didn't take it seriously, though. During a rare family dinner, my mother waved a hand at my laptop bag and said, "It's nice you have a hobby, Maya, but don't expect it to replace real work." Ethan laughed, showing off his new watch, another gift from them, while I sat there, my fingers tracing the worn edge of my notebook, holding back the words I wanted to say. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sting of their dismissal lingered, mixing with the exhaustion of balancing work and life. I got up at 2 a.m., brewed a pot of tea, and opened my email. There was a message from a startup in the city asking if I could pitch a full branding package for their launch. The potential payout was $10,000, more money than I'd ever seen from a single job. My heart raced as I read the details: modern logo, website mockups, social media graphics, all due in 6 weeks. It was a gamble, requiring time and resources I barely had, but I saw it as a chance to prove myself, not just to my family, but to me. I spent the next day sketching ideas, my hand cramping as I filled page after page with bold lines and colors. Lucas woke up to find me surrounded by paper, a grin spreading across his face. "You're onto something big, aren't you?" he said, and I nodded, the first real smile breaking through my fatigue. I submitted the pitch that afternoon, my fingers crossed, knowing this could be the turning point. 2 weeks later, the startup replied, My pitch was accepted. I jumped up from my chair, startling Lucas, who was chopping vegetables for dinner, and we hugged in the middle of our tiny kitchen, the smell of garlic filling the air. The $10,000 wasn't just money, it was validation. I hired a part-time assistant to help with the workload, using some of my savings, and threw myself into the project. The gym chain paid out, and with that cash, I upgraded my equipment, a new tablet and software that made my designs smoother and faster. My parents called to invite me to Ethan's latest celebration, a promotion party they were hosting, but I declined, citing work. "You're always busy with that little side thing," my father said, his tone edged with impatience. "Ethan's moving up in the world, Maya. You should support him." I bit my tongue, imagining the $50,000 they'd spent on his birthday now doubling for this event. Instead, I said, "I've got a deadline," and hung up, turning back to my screen where the startup's logo was taking shape. As I worked, the startup project grew into something bigger. The company liked my initial design so much, they asked me to expand the scope. Business cards, packaging, even a short ad video. The payout climbed to $15,000, and I felt the ground shifting under me. I was up late every night, my eyes burning from the screen, but I loved it. The control, the creativity, the proof that I could build something from nothing. Lucas started helping too, managing invoices and schedules, his quiet support an anchor when doubt crept in. One evening, I stepped outside onto our balcony, the city lights twinkling below, and breathed in the cool air. I'd risked it all, my savings, my stability, my pride, and it was paying off. But the family chat buzzed again, a photo of Ethan's promotion party, my parents raising glasses in a toast. "Proud of our boy," my mother wrote. I locked my phone, the ache returning, but this time it mixed with determination. They might not see me yet, but I was on my way to a place where their approval wouldn't matter. Little did I know, that place was closer than I thought, and the day I'd stand taller than their expectations was just around the corner. The startup project wrapped up in 5 weeks, ahead of schedule, and the $15,000 hit my account like a thunderclap. I stared at the number on my banking app, $17,342 total, including other recent jobs, and felt a rush I couldn't name. I paid off the last of my wedding loan, treated Lucas to a nice dinner, and put the rest into a business account I'd opened, dreaming of scaling up. My assistant suggested I pitch to bigger clients, and I started cold emailing companies, my portfolio growing with every success. One night, as I sat with Lucas reviewing a proposal, my phone rang, my mother, her voice unusually soft. "Maya, we're having a family dinner next week. Ethan's got big news, and we'd love for you to be there." I hesitated, the old pull of duty tugging at me, but something in me shifted. "I'll think about it," I said, and she sighed, clearly expecting more. I didn't call back to confirm. Instead, I focused on a pitch to a national retail brand, my heart pounding with the possibility. The rejection from my parents had hurt, but it had also pushed me to this edge where I was about to leap into something extraordinary. And as the days passed, that leap was about to land me somewhere they'd never imagined. A year after the startup project, I stood in my new office, a small, sunlit space I'd leased in the city, watching the skyline through a window that felt like a trophy. My freelance business had exploded in ways I'd never dared to dream. The national retail brand I'd pitched to had not only accepted my proposal, but hired me for a year-long contract to rebrand their entire chain, a deal worth $200,000. That contract opened doors to others, and soon I was managing a team of 5, designing for companies across the country. By May 18th, 2025, at 8:34 a.m., I checked my business account on a quiet Sunday morning, and the balance read $1,042,316. $1 million earned through late nights, bold risks, and a stubborn belief in myself. I'd done it. I'd turned the rejection of my wedding into a fire that fueled my success. And now, standing in my office with a steaming mug of coffee in my hand, I felt a quiet, unshakable pride. But the journey to this moment hadn't been smooth, and the family dinner I'd attended a month earlier had been the final push to leave my past behind. The dinner invitation from my mother had lingered in my mind for days. I'd almost declined, but Lucas encouraged me to go, saying, "Maybe it's time they see who you've become." So I went, wearing a simple black dress that felt more like armor than fashion, my hair pulled back in a neat bun. The restaurant was upscale, with dim lighting and the clink of wine glasses, a place my parents loved to show off. Ethan was at the center of the table, as always, his new promotion at a tech firm the reason for the gathering. My parents glowed with pride, my mother adjusting his tie like he was a child, my father clapping him on the back. I sat across from them, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for a moment to share my own news. When the conversation lulled, I took a deep breath and said, "I've hit a milestone too. My business crossed $1 million last week." The table went silent. My mother's fork froze midair. On swing, my father's smile faltered, and Ethan's eyes narrowed like he couldn't process the words. "A million?" my father finally said, his voice a mix of disbelief and something I couldn't place. Envy, maybe. "That's unexpected," my mother added, her tone sharp like my success was an inconvenience. Ethan recovered first, leaning back in his chair with a forced laugh. "A million, huh? From your little design thing? Come on, Maya, you don't have to exaggerate." His words stung, but I didn't flinch. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and slid it across the table. The screen showed the balance, clear as day, $1,042,316. My father stared at it, his jaw tight, while my mother's face turned pale. Ethan's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of something I'd never seen in him before: uncertainty. "I built this from nothing," I said, my voice steady. "No help, no handouts, just me." The silence stretched, heavy with their unspoken regret. My mother tried to pivot, her voice too bright. "Well, that's wonderful, Maya. We always knew you'd do something interesting." But her words felt hollow, and I saw the way her eyes darted to Ethan as if my success diminished his. My father cleared his throat, changing the subject to Ethan's promotion, but the air had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't invisible at their table, I was a force they couldn't ignore. I didn't stay for dessert. I stood, smoothed my dress, and said, "I have an early meeting tomorrow. Congratulations, Ethan." I walked out, the cool night air brushing my skin, and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. On the drive home, my phone buzzed with messages from the family chat. My mother's, "We need to talk." Ethan's, "You didn't have to show off like that." My father's, "Let's discuss this later." I didn't reply. Instead, I pulled into our new apartment, a bigger space Lucas and I had moved into after my first big contract, and found him waiting with a glass of wine and a smile. "How'd it go?" he asked. I told him everything, and he laughed, pulling me into a hug. "They'll never get it," he said, "but you don't need them to." He was right. That night, I deleted the family chat, years of messages vanishing with a single tap, and I didn't feel a shred of guilt. I'd spent so long craving their approval, but now I saw it for what it was: a chain I'd broken free from. The next morning, I got an email from a business magazine asking to feature my story in their Self-Made Entrepreneurs issue. They'd heard about my $1 million milestone through a client and wanted to interview me. I stared at the email, a grin spreading across my face, and replied with a yes. As I typed, I glanced at a photo on my desk. Me and Lucas on our wedding day, standing in that garden under the fairy lights, smiling like the world couldn't touch us. Back then, I'd felt small, overlooked, but now I saw the strength in that moment. I'd risked everything for that day, and it had set me on a path to this one. My parents and Ethan might never understand, but I didn't need them to. I had Lucas, my team, and a future I'd built with my own hands, a future that was about to shine even brighter. The magazine feature came out a week later, and I couldn't stop staring at the glossy pages on my desk. The headline read, "From Wedding Woes to a $1 million Empire, Maya's Journey of Resilience," with a photo of me in my office, sunlight streaming through the window, my arms crossed, and a quiet smile on my face. The article detailed my story: how I'd paid for my wedding alone after my parents refused to help, how they'd spent $50,000 on Ethan's party while I scraped by with a $1,500 garden venue, and how I'd turned that pain into a thriving design business. It mentioned the risks I'd taken, the late nights, the loan I'd paid off, and the $1 million milestone I'd hit by May 18th, 2025. I read the last line over and over. Maya didn't just build a business, she built a legacy of self-reliance. I felt a swell of pride, but it wasn't just the recognition that mattered. It was the realization that I'd done this without my family's support, without their belief in me. I'd spent so long trying to prove my worth to them, but this article, this moment, was proof I'd been enough all along. The feature spread faster than I expected. Clients emailed congratulations, my inbox flooded with inquiries from new companies, and my team celebrated with a small party in the office. Streamers, cupcakes, and a playlist Lucas made that echoed the one from our wedding. But the most surprising response came from a local business association. They invited me to speak at their annual conference, offering a $5,000 honorarium and a chance to network with industry leaders. I accepted immediately, my hands shaking as I typed the reply. The conference was in 2 weeks, and I spent every evening preparing my speech, writing and rewriting, wanting to tell my story in a way that would inspire others. Lucas helped me practice, sitting on our couch with a glass of water, nodding as I spoke about the wedding, the rejection, and the risks that led to my success. "You've got this," he said, his eyes steady with belief. I felt ready, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. My family's reaction to the article. My phone started buzzing the morning the magazine hit newsstands. First, it was my mother leaving a voicemail. "Maya, we saw the article. Why didn't you tell us it was this big? We need to talk." Then Ethan texted, his message dripping with sarcasm. "Nice story, sis. Didn't know you were so hard done by. Maybe stop playing the victim." My father's message was the coldest. "You didn't have to drag us into your little publicity stunt." I sat at my kitchen table, the magazine open in front of me, and read their words again and again. They weren't proud, weren't sorry, they were defensive, as if my success was an attack on them. I didn't respond. Instead, I blocked their numbers, a decision that felt both heavy and liberating. I'd hoped somewhere deep down that they'd see the article and finally understand the hurt they'd caused, but their messages showed me they never would. They couldn't handle a version of me that didn't need them, a version that stood taller than their expectations. I turned my focus to the conference, pouring my energy into the speech. The day of the event, I stood backstage, my heart pounding, wearing a navy blazer and a white blouse, my hair swept into a low bun. The room was packed with over 300 people, business owners, entrepreneurs, and journalists, all waiting to hear my story. I stepped onto the stage, the lights bright against my face, and started speaking. I told them about the wedding, the empty chairs where my parents should have been, the $50,000 they spent on Ethan's party, while I struggled to pay for my own. I shared how I'd risked everything, my savings, my stability, to build my business, and how I'd turned that rejection into $1 million empire. The audience was silent, hanging on my words, and when I finished, they erupted into applause, a standing ovation that brought tears to my eyes. I saw Lucas in the front row, clapping harder than anyone, his smile wide and proud. In that moment, I knew I'd found my true family, not the one I was born into, but the one I'd built with love, trust, and mutual respect. After the speech, I was swarmed with people wanting to connect. New clients, mentors, even a publisher who suggested I write a book about my journey. I exchanged business cards, my hands steady despite the whirlwind, and felt a sense of belonging I'd never known with my family. But as I left the venue, a familiar face caught my eye. Ethan standing by the exit, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I froze, my heart sinking. Lucas stepped closer, his hand on my arm, but I shook my head slightly. I could handle this. Ethan approached, his voice low. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his eyes flicking to the conference banner behind me. "Nice speech. Made us sound like the bad guys." I looked at him, the brother I'd once idolized, and saw the resentment in his gaze. "I told the truth," I said, my voice calm. "If that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should think about why." He scoffed, but there was no fight in him, just a flicker of regret he'd never admit. I walked past him, Lucas at my side, and didn't look back. The conference had shown me my worth, but Ethan's presence reminded me of the cost, and I knew the next step was to let go completely in a way I hadn't yet. Back at home that night, I sat on our balcony, the city lights stretching out like a sea of stars. Lucas brought me a cup of chamomile tea, the steam curling in the cool air, and sat beside me. "You were incredible today," he said, his hand finding mine. I smiled, but my mind was on Ethan's words, the way my family still saw my success as a betrayal. I opened my laptop and started writing a letter, not to them, but for myself. I poured out everything: the hurt of their rejection, the strength I'd found in myself, the $1 million that proved I didn't need their validation. When I finished, I printed it, folded it into an envelope, and tucked it into a drawer. I didn't need to send it. Writing it was enough, a final release of the pain I'd carried. As I closed the drawer, I felt lighter, like I'd shed the last piece of their hold on me. The future was mine now, and I was ready to step into it fully, with no shadows trailing behind. But life, as I'd learned, always had one more surprise waiting. The next morning at 8:36 a.m. PKT on Sunday, May 18th, 2025, I woke to the soft hum of the city outside our balcony, the sunlight spilling across our bedroom floor like a warm invitation. Lucas was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady, and I slipped out of bed quietly, wrapping a robe around myself. I made my way to the kitchen, the scent of last night's tea lingering, and brewed a fresh pot of coffee. As I stood there stirring in a spoonful of sugar, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was an email from the Business Association, thanking me for my conference speech and offering a partnership to mentor young entrepreneurs. The subject line read, "A new opportunity for Maya." And as I read the details, monthly workshops, a stipend, and a chance to shape others' futures, I felt a surge of purpose. This wasn't just about my success anymore. It was about sharing what I'd learned, turning my pain into something that could lift others up. I leaned against the counter, the coffee warming my hands, and smiled, knowing this was the next chapter I'd been waiting for. But the peace of that moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. I frowned, glancing at the clock. 8:42 a.m., too early for visitors. Lucas stirred in the bedroom, and I padded to the door, peering through the peephole. My heart skipped when I saw my mother standing there, her face tight with something I couldn't read. Regret, maybe, or desperation. I hesitated, my hand on the knob, the letter I'd written last night flashing in my mind. Lucas appeared behind me, his hair messy, and whispered, "You don't have to let her in." I nodded, but something in me needed closure. I opened the door, keeping the chain latched. "Maya," she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "can we talk? Your father and Ethan are waiting downstairs." I looked past her, seeing my father's car parked below, Ethan slouched in the passenger seat. "About what?" I asked, my tone cool. She shifted, her hands twisting together. "The article, the speech. We didn't realize how much we hurt you. We want to make it right." Her words hung in the air, and I felt a flicker of the old hope, the part of me that had always wanted their love. But I also felt the weight of my $1 million, my new office, my life with Lucas, and I knew I didn't need their amends. I unlatched the chain and stepped onto the landing, closing the door behind me to keep Lucas out of it. "Make it right?" I said, my voice steady. "You spent $50,000 on Ethan's party while I paid for my wedding alone. You dismissed my dreams, my work, my worth. And now, because I've succeeded, you want back in?" My mother's eyes glistened, but she didn't interrupt. My father stepped out of the car, Ethan following, their faces a mix of guilt and pride they couldn't hide. "We're sorry," my father said, his voice gruff. "We didn't see it then, but we see it now." Ethan shifted, mumbling, "Yeah, congrats or whatever." I looked at them, the people who'd shaped so much of my pain, and felt a strange calm. "I appreciate the apology," I said, "but it's too late. I built this life without you, and I'm not letting you back in just because I've made $1 million. I don't need your approval anymore." My mother reached out, but I stepped back. "Take care," I added, and turned back inside, locking the door behind me. Lucas was there, his arms open, and I sank into them, tears slipping free for the first time in months. Later that day, I sat on the balcony with Lucas, the city stretching out below us, the email about the mentorship glowing on my laptop. I'd emailed my acceptance, and the thought of guiding others filled me with a quiet joy. We talked about the future, expanding the business, maybe starting a family, and I felt the weight of my past lift completely. I thought about the garden wedding, the empty chairs, the $50,000 party, and the risks I'd taken to get here. I'd outgrown the need for my family's validation, not out of spite, but out of strength. That afternoon, I took the envelope with my letter, the one I'd written for myself, and burned it in a small metal bowl on the balcony, the ashes drifting away in the breeze. It was a final goodbye, not to them, but to the version of me who'd begged for their love. As the last ember faded, I planted a small lavender bush in a pot, its purple buds a promise of growth, and smiled. "Maybe I'm blooming too," I said aloud, and Lucas laughed, his hand finding mine. The days that followed were quiet, filled with work and love, no calls from my family breaking the peace. I checked my phone once, seeing their numbers still blocked, and felt no urge to unblock them. The mentorship began, and my first workshop was a success, with young entrepreneurs nodding as I shared my story. How rejection fueled my fire, how risking it all led to a million, how silence became my strength. One student, a young woman with determined eyes, thanked me after, saying, "You showed me I don't need anyone's permission to succeed." Her words echoed my own journey, and I knew I'd found my purpose. That night, I stood in our kitchen cooking dinner with Lucas, the smell of garlic and herbs filling the air, and thought about how far I'd come. When I didn't need to prove my worth to my parents or Ethan, they'd looked regretful that morning, but I wasn't waiting for their change of heart. I'd built a life that was mine, earned through every late night and every risk, and it was more beautiful than any party they could ever throw. Have you ever outgrown people who once made you feel small, just by standing tall in silence? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if no one's told you today, you don't need to prove your worth. You already have it.